A 6-year-old girl vanishes from one of the wealthiest homes in Boulder, Colorado. A ransom note appears on the staircase, asking for an oddly specific sum, $118. Police are called. Friends gather. Panic spreads through the house. But hours later, the most chilling truth emerges. JonBenét Ramsey was never taken away at all. She was still inside the home. That single fact turned a kidnapping into one of the most haunting murder cases in American history. Nearly 3 decades later, no one has been convicted. No answer has fully satisfied. And one question still refuses to die. What really happened inside that house on Christmas night? Christmas in Boulder should have ended as a picture of comfort. The Ramsey family looked, from the outside, like the kind of American success story people are taught to admire. John Ramsey was a successful businessman. Patsy Ramsey was polished, socially visible, and deeply invested in the image of a bright, accomplished family. Their daughter, JonBenét, was known publicly for child beauty pageants, tiny crowns, practiced smiles, and the kind of visibility that can make a child seem familiar even to strangers. Their home was large, elegant, and decorated for the season. The setting was warm, affluent, and festive. And that is exactly why the case hit the public with such force. It did not begin in a dark alley or some forgotten roadside. It began in the heart of a privileged home, on the morning after Christmas, in a place that looked protected from the world outside. In the early hours of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey reported that her daughter was missing. A handwritten ransom note had been found in the house. It demanded $118 for JonBenét's safe return. That number was strange enough to immediately raise questions. It was not a round number. It was not an amount designed for dramatic effect. It was close to John Ramsey's recent bonus. A detail that seemed to point not toward a faceless criminal mastermind, but toward someone who might know the family more intimately than anyone wanted to admit. Almost at once, the case split into 2 terrifying possibilities. Either a predator had entered the home and understood the family well enough to exploit private details, or the danger had not come from outside at all. That is one reason this case became more than a homicide. It became a national obsession. America was not only reacting to the death of a child, it was reacting to a contradiction it could not comfortably resolve. The victim was young, visible, and surrounded by symbols of innocence and status. The setting suggested safety. The note suggested staging, calculation, or familiarity. And as cameras began to circle, the case turned into something larger than an investigation. It became a mirror for public anxieties about family image, wealth, performance, and the dangerous gap between how life appears and what may be hidden beneath it. The public did not just want to know who did it. It wanted to know whether evil had broken in from outside, or whether it had been sitting much closer all along. Then came the moment that changed everything. JonBenét was found dead inside the house, in the basement, several hours after the initial 911 call. In one stroke, the logic of the ransom note began to collapse. If this was a kidnapping, why was she still there? If it was a murder disguised as a kidnapping, who had the time, nerve, and proximity to construct that illusion? The home, once the center of panic, became the center of suspicion. Every hallway, every staircase, every room suddenly felt different, not just like part of a crime scene, but like part of a performance whose author remained unknown. And from that point forward, the case was no longer only about evidence. It was about misdirection, about what had been placed in plain sight, about what had been believed too quickly because it arrived wrapped in the familiar language of fear. One of the most unsettling lessons begins here. Human beings are often slow to recognize danger when it wears the costume of normal life. A decorated home, a respected family, a holiday morning, a mother's terrified voice. These are the kinds of details that naturally guide perception. They make us trust the frame before we understand the facts. In many real-world tragedies, that is how risk hides best, not by looking monstrous, but by blending into what feels ordinary, familiar, and emotionally persuasive. The JonBenét Ramsey case forces us to confront that uncomfortable truth from the very beginning. Appearances do not merely fail to protect us. Sometimes, they actively delay our understanding of what is wrong. And yet the deeper investigators looked, the less straightforward the story became. The note was bizarre. The timeline was troubling. The scene was already becoming compromised. The house was full of emotion, movement, and people. Before the nation had even decided what it believed, the case had already started drifting into confusion. What should have been the clearest first hours of an investigation were turning into something else entirely, something blurred, contested, and possibly damaged in ways that could never be fully reversed. And that is where the real nightmare of this case begins, not simply with a child's death, but with the possibility that the truth may have started slipping away almost immediately. The first hours of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation have become almost as infamous as the crime itself. What should have been a tightly controlled scene quickly turned into something looser, noisier, and far more fragile, after Patsy Ramsey called 911 early on December 26. Police arrived within minutes, but the house did not remain sealed in the way a homicide scene would demand. Friends, family acquaintances, and movement through the home complicated the environment before investigators even understood what they were truly dealing with. In cases like this, that matters more than most people realize. The earliest hours are when truth is most vulnerable. Once a scene is disturbed, certainty begins to erode, and from that moment on, every theory must fight through the fog of what may already have been altered, missed, or misunderstood. At the center of that fog was the ransom note. It was long, handwritten, and strangely theatrical. It warned the Ramseys not to contact police. Yet police were called immediately. It demanded exactly $118, a figure that drew attention because it closely matched John Ramsey's recent bonus. That detail made the note feel less like a message from a distant criminal and more like something written by someone with knowledge of the household. Investigators and the public alike began asking the same unsettling question. Was this note a real demand? Or was it a script meant to steer everyone away from a different truth? Even now, that note remains one of the most disturbing elements in the case, not only because of what it said, but because of what it seemed designed to do. It gave fear a direction. It gave confusion a shape. And it may have done both before anyone had the chance to think clearly. Then came the discovery that shattered the kidnapping narrative. Several hours after the 911 call, John Ramsey found JonBenét's body in a basement room inside the house. From that instant, the case changed form completely. A child who was supposedly taken for ransom had never left the home. That contradiction was not a small inconsistency. It was the core wound of the entire case. It suggested staging, deception, or a plan gone wrong. It raised questions about the sequence of events, about who knew what, and about whether the story presented at the beginning had been false from the start. Once that happened, suspicion did not settle neatly in one place. It spread outward, touching the family, the possibility of an intruder, and the investigators themselves. Because if the original appearance of the crime was misleading, then almost everything had to be re-examined from the ground up. This is where the case became larger than evidence alone. It became a study in how people interpret danger under emotional pressure. Most of us want early events to make sense. We want the frightened mother, the ransom note, the call for help, the wealthy house, the holiday setting, all to fit into a familiar pattern. But real investigations are often derailed by that hunger for an immediate story. The human mind hates uncertainty, so it grabs whatever seems coherent first. Sometimes that instinct protects us. Sometimes it blinds us. The JonBenét case is a haunting example of how quickly narratives can harden before facts are ready. And once they do, every new detail is filtered through loyalty, suspicion, class assumptions, and fear. What should be a search for truth slowly becomes a battle of competing realities. As attention intensified, so did the contradictions. Was there really an intruder? Was the scene staged? Were investigators chasing evidence, or being dragged by public pressure and early mistakes? The case no longer looked like a single mystery. It was becoming several mysteries layered on top of one another. And beneath all of them was the most troubling possibility of all. That the answer might not be hidden because it was too complex, but because too many errors, assumptions, and emotional reactions had already buried it. In Part 3, the investigation goes deeper, and the line between evidence and interpretation becomes even more dangerous. By the time the JonBenét Ramsey case moved deeper into formal investigation, it was no longer just a search for a killer. It had become a struggle between competing interpretations of the same broken scene. Detectives, prosecutors, outside experts, and the public were no longer asking only what happened. They were asking how the evidence should even be read. That distinction matters, because some cases are not destroyed by a lack of clues. They are damaged by an overload of clues that seem to point in different directions. In the Ramsey case, that conflict became one of the central tragedies. Instead of converging quickly toward one clear answer, the investigation fractured into rival narratives: family involvement, intruder theory, staging, contamination, prosecutorial disagreement, and each of those narratives shaped what investigators believed they were seeing. One of the most enduring fault lines centered on the ransom note and the absence of clear forced entry. Early suspicion naturally turned inward. Statistically, in the homicide of a child, investigators often begin close to home. That instinct is not prejudice, it is standard investigative logic. But logic can harden into tunnel vision if it is not checked. Over time, disagreement inside the case grew sharper. Some investigators remained convinced that the evidence suggested staging from within the household. Others argued that the investigation had grown too narrow too quickly and had failed to adequately account for the possibility of an outsider. The most troubling part is not simply that people disagreed. It is that the disagreement appears to have become so entrenched that it shaped the direction of the case itself. In other words, the investigation was not only trying to solve a mystery, it was also struggling with its own internal war over what kind of mystery this was. Then there was DNA, perhaps the most debated element in the entire case. Over the years, biological evidence recovered from JonBenét's clothing contributed to arguments that an unknown male may have been involved. And in 2008, the district attorney's office publicly said DNA results excluded the Ramsey family as suspects. But that did not end the debate. Critics and experts have long argued that trace DNA can be difficult to interpret and may not, by itself, tell a complete story about how or when it was deposited. Even today, Boulder authorities say the case remains open, that DNA remains part of the picture, and that more evidence is still needed to prove guilt in court. That is the cruel paradox of modern forensics. Science can illuminate a case, but when evidence is partial, contested, or vulnerable to multiple explanations, it can also deepen uncertainty rather than resolve it. The case also carries the shadow of the grand jury. In 1999, a grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges related to placing JonBenét in a dangerous situation and allegedly hindering the prosecution of the person responsible. But the district attorney declined to move forward, saying the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction is critical. A grand jury does not decide guilt, it decides whether there is probable cause to bring charges. And here lies one of the darkest lessons of the case: suspicion. Even serious suspicion is not the same as proof. Public opinion rarely respects that boundary. The law must. In unsolved crimes, especially those involving children, people often hunger for certainty so badly that they start treating theories as verdicts. But once a society gets comfortable doing that, it becomes easier to ruin lives without actually finding truth. That is why the JonBenét case still unsettles people decades later. It is not only the death of a child, it is the possibility that a combination of panic, early missteps, fractured institutions, media pressure, and human bias may have helped bury the cleanest path to the truth. The deeper one looks, the less this case feels like a single act of violence and the more it feels like a warning about how fragile truth becomes when fear enters the room first. And in part 4, that warning becomes even heavier, because the final picture is not just about who may have done it, but about what this case revealed about family image, media spectacle, and the limits of justice itself. What makes the JonBenét Ramsey case endure is not only that it remains officially unsolved. It is that the case exposed how fragile justice can become when grief, status, spectacle, and uncertainty collide in the same room. Over time, the question of who killed JonBenét was joined by another question that may be almost as disturbing. How much truth can a system lose before the loss becomes permanent? Boulder investigators have repeatedly said the case is still open, that evidence continues to be reviewed, and that advances in DNA technology may still matter. Yet the passage of time cuts both ways. Science can improve, memories do not. Witnesses age, narratives harden, and the emotional climate around a case can become so polluted that even a breakthrough must fight through decades of suspicion, rumor, and public mythology. In that sense, this case is not frozen in the past. It is still unfolding beneath the weight of everything that has already been said about it. The family at the center of the case lived for years inside a storm of accusation and scrutiny. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006. John Ramsey has continued to publicly call for more advanced testing and renewed investigative effort. That alone gives the story an ache that statistics cannot capture. Whether one believes the most likely answer lies inside the home or outside it. The human cost of uncertainty is enormous. An unsolved child homicide does not end when the cameras leave. It mutates. It becomes a permanent wound in a family, a permanent stain on institutions, and a permanent invitation for the public to project its own fears and assumptions onto the dead. In many cases, people think unresolved crime is frightening because it withholds an ending. But sometimes what is truly frightening is what fills the space where the ending should have been: speculation, tribal loyalties, and the slow normalization of not knowing. There is also a broader lesson here about image. The Ramsey home looked like the kind of place danger should not enter. Wealth suggested control, social standing suggested safety, family presentation suggested order, but crimes do not respect appearances, and investigations can be distorted by them. Sometimes privilege draws harsher suspicion. Sometimes it draws gentler treatment. Sometimes it does both at once, creating confusion where clarity is needed most. The JonBenét case reminds us that polished surfaces are not evidence of truth. A home can be beautiful and still conceal panic. A family can appear composed and still be falling apart under pressure. A community can look civilized and still mishandle the most important hours of an investigation. This is why vigilance matters, not paranoia, but humility. We should be careful of quick judgments, careful of emotional narratives that arrive too neatly, and careful of the instinct to believe that tragedy always announces itself in obvious ways. Often it does the opposite. It hides inside routine, reputation, and the false comfort of what seems normal. And that may be the deepest educational lesson of all. People rarely ignore danger because they are foolish. More often, they ignore it because the mind protects itself with familiarity. We trust what resembles ordinary life. We assume that holiday mornings, respectable neighborhoods, successful families, and practiced smiles mean we are standing near safety. But risk can live quietly behind those symbols. So can manipulation. So can denial. So can the human tendency to protect identity before truth. The tragedy of JonBenét Ramsey is not only that a child died and no court has delivered a final answer. It is that the case became a national demonstration of how easily certainty can collapse, how quickly narratives can overtake evidence, and how hard it is to recover truth once the first critical moments are lost. That is why the story still haunts America, not because it is mysterious in an entertaining way, but because it forces us to confront a more uncomfortable possibility. Sometimes the scariest thing is not evil itself. It is how poorly people recognize it when it is standing close enough to touch. JonBenét Ramsey never grew up. The house grew silent, the years kept moving, and the country kept arguing. But beneath every theory, every headline, and every reenactment, one fact remains untouched. A child lost her future, and the truth slipped into the cracks left behind by fear, error, and time. Some cases haunt us because they are brutal. This one haunts us because it may have been solvable, and because that possibility is harder to live with than mystery itself. If there is one final lesson the JonBenét Ramsey case leaves behind, it is this: life is far more fragile than the stories we tell ourselves about safety. People build homes, routines, reputations, and traditions because they want to believe these things can hold chaos back. We decorate the house, celebrate the holiday, kiss our children goodnight, and trust that love alone can protect what matters most. But this case reminds us that security is not something we can assume into existence. It must be guarded with attention, honesty, humility, and the courage to face what feels uncomfortable before it becomes irreversible. There is also a painful truth here about appearances. So much of human life is spent managing how things look from the outside. Families want to appear strong. Communities want to appear peaceful. Institutions want to appear competent. But truth does not care about appearances. A smiling photograph can hide pressure. A successful household can hide distance, stress, or unseen vulnerability. A respected system can still make irreversible mistakes. One of the deepest life lessons in this case is that what looks polished is not always what is safe. And what feels familiar is not always what is harmless. The longer we confuse image with truth, the easier it becomes for danger, denial, and error to survive undetected. This case also teaches something profound about time. We often believe that if enough time passes, truth will naturally rise to the surface. But that is not always how life works. Sometimes time heals. Sometimes it only hardens uncertainty. A missed warning, a careless assumption, a compromised first response, a truth not pursued fiercely enough in the beginning. These things do not always return for a second chance. That is why vigilance matters in everyday life. Not constant fear, but awareness. Not suspicion of everything, but respect for the fact that important moments can disappear forever if we are too distracted, too trusting, or too eager to believe the easiest version of events. And perhaps the most human lesson of all is about compassion. When a tragedy becomes famous, people often turn it into a puzzle before they remember it was first to life. They debate theories, choose sides, accuse, defend, speculate, and consume the story as if mystery were the main event. But at the center of this case was a child, a real child, a short life, a stolen future, a family shattered, and a country that kept watching. The moral danger in cases like this is that we can become so obsessed with solving the riddle that we lose sight of the human cost. Real wisdom begins when we remember that behind every headline is grief. And behind every unsolved question is a wound that never fully closes. So the deeper meaning of this case is not only about crime. It is about how we live. It is about paying closer attention to the people around us. It is about protecting children not only with love, but with presence, caution, and responsibility. It is about resisting blind trust in surfaces, status, or routine. It is about recognizing that truth is precious because once it is blurred by fear, ego, confusion, or delay, recovering it can take a lifetime, or may never happen at all. And in that sense, the JonBenét Ramsey case leaves behind a lesson that reaches far beyond one house, one family, or one winter night. Life asks us to be more awake than we usually are. Because what we fail to see in time can haunt us far longer than what we were brave enough to face.